Robben Island, for whatever reasons, was home to South Africa's icons. It is here that the men who attempted to speak against South Africa's black oppression were kept, so that whatever they wanted to speak would never go beyond the waters that surrounded this island. Yes, it is the island that housed the likes of Nelson Mandela, Walter Sisulu, Govan Mbeki, and many others as political prisoners. And to many, Robben Island has been known and understood in this regard. But there is the other side that many do not know much about. Robben is Dutch name for seal. The island sits in South Africa's Table Bay, only 4.5 miles or 7 kilometers from Cape Town's beaches, though it is no pleasure resort. Instead, it has served as a place of imprisonment, banishment, and isolation for some centuries, most notably housing the leaders of South Africa's anti-apartheid movements. During the Asian eras, the island, actually the tip of a now submerged mountain, was connected to the mainland. At the close of the last ice age, some 12,000 years ago, rising sea levels separated it from the shoreline. When the Dutch arrived to settle in Cape in the 17th century, they soon began to put the island to use as a prison, a role it continued to play until 1991. During the 19th century, African chiefs of various tribes were banished to this island. Muslim leaders from Dutch colonies in the East Indies were also imprisoned here, as were colonial soldiers and civilians. In the same century, people suffering from mental illness and leprosy were also isolated on Robben Island.
There was a Leper Repression Act that was passed, and globally leper colonies would have been opened up with the sort of belief and thinking that a cure to leprosy would be that if all the lepers die out and they are buried within leper colonies, the disease will come to an end.
Robben Island's most poignant period was the late 20th century, when the facility was used as a maximum security prison for political prisoners of South Africa's apartheid regime. Beginning 1962, Black, Indian, and mixed-race inmates were held here, including most famously future South African President Nelson Mandela. No wonder. The first site of the island is the prison that now stands as a museum.
In 1995, we had a reunion of ex-political prisoners, and it was then that we took a decision that Robben Island must be closed down as a prison because we wanted it to be declared a museum. And that is why in 1996, all the prisoners that were here were taken to other prisons on mainland, so that means Robben Island was closed down as a prison in 1996.
On a guided tour of Robben Island, it is clear that the island was once a leper colony with the leper graveyard that is right after the prison museum. The graveyard has over 1,200 graves of lepers who died in isolation here. However, what is left of these lepers is the leper church, which dates back to the island's isolation as a leper colony.
So the 1890s, Reverend Watkins was on the island. He felt that lepers needed a place of worship, approached the authority, and the conclusion was that he had to buy a piece of property to have a church built. And he spent about £1,000, money that he inherited, bought a piece of land as requested, had the church built, and it then became the very first, and interesting enough, the only privately owned piece of property.
And when leprosy treatment was discovered in the 1920s, all leper colonies were closed, patients removed, and all facilities used by them brought down. But the leper church is the only building that remained because of its private status and is now owned by the Anglican Church of South Africa. After the graveyard, we meet dog kennels that many oftentimes mistake to be prison cells. In the later 90s, dogs like the German Shepherd and others were introduced on the island for security, and a once Sobukwe cell became home for the dogs. From the kennels, one clearly sees the lime quarry, a place out of bounds and only viewed from the tour van. We were only privileged as media to access it.
Every morning when it was time for the prisoners to work, this was the place.
The lime quarry is a place where hard labor was administered to the prisoners, mainly the leaders. Pickaxes and shovels were used to excavate lime that was used to construct roads and other facilities on the island. And to end our Robben Island tour, we visit the oldest building on the island, Garrison Church.
Oldest structure on the island, always utilized as a church, still being utilized as a church, interdenominational church today. But the museum uses it mainly on Valentine's Day for weddings that takes place. Every year since the museum opened up, couples have come over to tie the knot on the island. But it is a community church. There are about 250 people living on Robben Island today, and they would use that church for their church services.
The Garrison Church also has a tradition that dates back from the Second World War, where a blue or pink flag is hoisted at the top of the church whenever a child is born on the island. The inhabitants of the island are only those that are employed by the museum. It currently has 250 inhabitants, with about 8 former political prisoners and 2 former prison guards. Thousands of tourists throng this island, with about 1,300 visiting on a low peak season and up to 2,000 on a high peak. It is open all year through and only closed on 1st May, Workers' Day. Over and above its history, the fauna and flora of Robben Island are extremely interesting, and their conservation is another goal of the museum. There are 132 bird species on the island, some of them endangered, as well as small heads of antelope. Robben Island Museum has World Heritage status achieved in 1999 and is a South African National Heritage Site. For NBS Focus on South Africa, I'm Mildred Tohaise. NBS, live at 9.